Opened in 1929 by the Canadian Pacific Railway, the Royal York was once the biggest hotel in the British Empire, and certainly one of the most luxurious. Paul Robeson was one of many black performers who had to use the back door to enter the hotel. In the early post-war years, most of the large downtown Toronto hotels had unionized staff. In 1961-62, the CPR solidified its intention to break union strength in Toronto's hospitality industry. Gripping the 1,200 members of Local 299 of the Hotel and Club Employees Union in a bitter 11-month strike. The CPR used the tunnel connecting Union Station to the hotel as a recruitment office for scabs. The strike divided the city, with some government officials crossing the picket line to hold meetings there. Unitu now represents workers at the Royal York, a key location for many of its current campaigns.
There is an ancestral Huron-Wendat village, and at Tabor Hill near Bellamy and Lawrence there is a Huron-Wendat ossuary. But as we go about our daily activities, we recognize the reality of the historical maltreatment of Indigenous peoples across Canada and support the Truth and Reconciliation process as led by Calvin Murray Sinclair as chair of the Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I know that you will join me in pledging our collective efforts to resist and challenge colonial heritage and practices. Thank you. So, this is a history of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. They were almost deemed to be terrorists for years by the media. They just were accosted on a regular basis, including the strike for maternity leave. They were called selfish for doing that. So again, I just want to, a lot of you, and I'm going to be asking you some questions in a minute, but first to tell you I'm a Toronto East End born. I have kids there, grandkids there. I was a community and labor activist for 40 years. I worked in the Regent Park community for many moons. And what changed my life when I grew up in middle class, the Beaches. And back then it was a mixed community. And one of my best friends lived in a basement apartment on Queen Street. And it got flooded, as does happen with climate change these days. And I've never forgot how, I was 7 years old, he was treated terribly by the neighbors, the school. They just almost like condemned him from being poor. And I started to realize that there is a different world out there, and that some of us need to stand in solidarity with others to make a difference in life. He was my friend. So that's what influenced me to begin my life of social activism, and just to share that with you. How many of you were born either during the 70s or before? Just indicating the hands. Okay. That's helpful because it's a different world. How many were born in the 1980s and 1990s? Perfect. And anybody 2000 plus? Not to worry. How many people use cards and letters ever today? Me as well. I still send mine out every year by post. And again, people appreciate receiving it. How many people still pay their bills by check?
Only Mayworks bills, because the union still is supposed to.
No, listen, and the union still pays a lot of us some expenses by check in the mail. But again, and the reason I'm bringing that up, and you'll hear about me as I go through this, businesses in Canada, that was the way they dealt with their business for decades. And that's why they were so adamant against the CUPW for their work, because they wanted the money in. How many receive packages through Canada Post? Okay, good. Because we all know what's going on in this world, let alone with the current President of the United States. I mean, the packaging world has changed immensely. So, the thing that I never forget of being an activist in those days, it was fascinating. The media attacked CUPW every day, and they would do polls back then. They would poll Canadians in a non-strike situation and ask them, do you support the postal workers going on strike? And the majority of people would say no, because again, it would stop the delivery of whatever they were going to receive. But then they would poll them during the strike, a strike, because the postal workers had a few. And then they would say, do you support the postal workers going on strike? The vast majority of Canadians supporting them, because they knew if you were going to go on strike, there had to be a reason for it, and they always supported them for that. So I always found it ironic, this double message that Canadians gave and the media received. So there's another history to this that I need to share with you before we go. Of course, one of the longest standing unions for years was the sleeping car porter union, blacks that were excluded from the rail union. Their first negotiating meeting was held in the Royal York Hotel. And one of my favorite stories, I don't know if people are familiar with Philip Randolph, who was on the Martin Luther King Jr. March to Washington and helped organize it. So he comes with the sleeping car porters to the front, and they were prepared to go in the back door, because that's always how they'd been treated. And Randolph just said to them, no, we're going in the front door today, brothers, and took them right in the front door of Royal York. And I've always loved that story. This also, by the way, two of the great leaders of the sleeping car porters in Canada, and they became our civil rights leaders, was Stanley Grizel. If you go to the main subway station, there's a plaque for him across from the main subway station. And Donald Moore, there's a plaque for him on Cecil Street. He turned his own house into a community center. And in 1954, they organized a train to Ottawa, because what a great country, eh? We invite people to come here, but there were two different rules. And again, it's almost going back to old songs. But if you were white, and if you came from Australia, or if you came from England, you could easily get citizenship. But if you were black and you came from the West Indies, you had to wait. So they took a train to Ottawa, met with the Prime Minister and the Immigration Minister, and finally got that law changed. That if you came from a Commonwealth country, regardless, you were allowed to get your citizen in short order. And that's what they contributed to us. By the way, this also was the site of the proud union that still works here, the Hotel and Restaurant Employees. They're now called Unite here. And they had a classic strike in 1961. There's a tunnel that goes from the hotel over to Union Station. And people are going to be okay if I use the word scab? That's the only word I know. I've been on strike 3 times myself. And anyways, the scabs were coming in through the tunnel. So of course they had to organize with that and got other people's support for that. So I just wanted you to hear that. This also was the location, because before the Canadian Union of Postal Workers was formed in 1965, there was the Canadian Postal Employee Association, and they met here at the Royal York to have a back-to-work vote. And again, they wanted to stay out. It was an historic strike. I'm going to give you more details later. But in the midst of the meeting, lo and behold, in comes a telegram for 2 of the leaders of the Montreal local, William Houle and Roger Descartes. And it said that it announced that the Montreal local was going back to work. It's discovered later, welcome brother, it was discovered later that it was a fraudulent telegram, that they never sent it. The same telegram was sent to the Vancouver local at the time. And so the postal workers, not knowing otherwise, all voted to go back to work. But there was a work afoot to undermine their union at that time. This also was the location in 1989. Anybody know who the Fraser Institute is? That ongoing people that, privatization is their bread and butter. And they had a big conference here to talk about privatizing the Canada Post at that point, and CUPW members did a picket line outside here. Now here's another location up here, the famous Strathcona Hotel. Now if you were a postie back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that's where you'd go for a beverage at the end of the work. And it was a famous location for that. It was the old school, where there was a separate entrance for men and women, if you remember those days, ladies and escorts. But this also became, in later years, where they locked up people who were detained as immigrants and refugees They locked them in the upper floors of the Strathcona Hotel. And a lot of us who were trying to support those people to get access and rights as people would come out here and do demonstrations right by that hotel. Sorry, I didn't mean to slow there.
What year?
And that, that would have, oh God, you got me there. I'm sorry, I'm a history guy, but that would have been the 80s. Sorry about that. Now, the other piece I'm going to change is add a couple of other pieces to this. People see the stamp for Albert Johnson in the last couple of years. He was the first black mail carrier. In 1882, he began working at the Toronto General Post Office. At first, he was refused training by his post office colleagues and was discriminated against due to racism. Blacks at that time were restricted to certain occupations, similar to the railway porters, right? As white workers did not want to work with them, and Jackson was reassigned as a mail porter. The black community wrote letters. One of the things oftentimes, you hear this history, but they always portray the white heroes who kind of saved the day, but they don't always talk about the black community's involvement in this. And they were very active in this. And so they sent massive letters to try to get his classification changed. A Methodist minister called the postmen cowards. The issue was highly debated and talked about in Toronto newspapers, and this led to the harassment of black citizens by whites on Toronto's streets. A mass meeting was held at the BME, Richmond Street Church. Everybody know what the BME stands for, the British Methodist, I'm going to stumble here, Episcopalian. It's one of the oldest black churches in our city, and that's where they met. And they reached out, and they actually were able to convince John A. Macdonald in the 1882 election to change Jackson's classification back to mail carrier. The story is that Macdonald did it to gain votes, which isn't interesting. He was a smart guy that way, always looking for votes. Now, I don't know if anybody knows Harvard Village. There is a Jackson Lane there that was created in 2013. There's also a plaque that Heritage Toronto has made, and there's a Canada Post stamp. And it's kind of ironic, but Canada Post has a new postal parcel sorting facility at Markham and Steeles, and it's named after Jackson. So that's great to honor him as well. Now, women in the post office. 1918, during the 1918 postal strike, when they were still an employee association, the wives of striking postal workers did a massive parade of supporting their union up to Queen's Park. Because again, this is a thing that has happened throughout labor history. The wives are accused of trying to encourage their men to return to work. These women went out on the streets to make it clear that they weren't out there to tell their men to get back to work. They were out there to get the strike settled and to support their brothers and mothers, and men. The post office, again, typically in Canadian history, right after World War II, a lot of married women who had worked as postal clerks, as sorters during World War II, were fired and sent back home, as they did in a number of locations. I was a municipal worker, City of Toronto, for many years, and we had a similar history. But it's fascinating that things changed quickly in the 50s, and large numbers of women were hired back. The restrictions on married women holding civil service jobs, including the post office, in 1955 were abolished. By the way, we looked into, in the municipal sector, there was a time where you had to live in the City of Toronto to work here. And what changed that law was the vets coming back after World War II, because they couldn't afford to live in Toronto in those days. So they changed the law. It didn't matter where you lived, you could work. Of course, women were restricted in those days. Now, Canada's only women letter carrier, Nora Stackard, was fired 1.5 days after her job because of her gender. And the president of the Victoria letter carrier protested the hiring of her, not the firing. He just said clearly, it's a man's job. He did the James Brown thing in a different way. Things changed quickly. In the 60s, there's 33,200 part-timers working in the post office, virtually all of them women. And CUPW then began to organize the part-time workers. And by 1970, the percentage of women members jumps to about 20%, and they CUPW changed their entire direction. So they made the part-timers have equal wages and benefits to the full-timers. That's what a lot of us have done around casualization in the workplace. That's what my union did as well, to sort of limit that separation. And that's what a lot of employers do. They figure the simple way to do is hire people at a lower wage part-time, and that's going to undermine the strength of the union. The way around this is to have the wage rates and the benefits comparable, and that's what happened. Now, thank you, and listen, good luck at the end of the month, man. Listen, I know you guys are going back out, right? No, let me give you this too. Just a history map I've done.
Thank you for preaching, I appreciate it.
No, man, and I'm gonna be, that's just a labor history tour. Where do you work?
600 commissions.
Okay,
Yeah.
I know that location.
So I deliver less.
Good for you, man. Thanks for what you do.
Thank you for this.
Solidarity. Thank you so much for coming by. Thank you. Wow, that's so sweet. I'm going to get into the 1981 strike later as we come down to another location. Anybody here remember Deborah Burke? There you go. Proud leader, one of the first women elected to the executive of CUPW. She served it proudly for years, so just wanted to add that. And then in the year 2000, the last piece I'll just throw in this was the World March of Women in the year 2000. And CUPW organized a large contingent to join that. And they literally walked across our country. Now, mail in the 60s and 70s. Mostly in the 60s, it was mostly personal letters and cards. Like, what goes through the mail has changed dramatically in our lifetime, right? Like back then, that was the deal. It was receiving a card or a letter. Then there was the advent of business advertising. Do you remember that whole thing of people putting signs on their doors, no junk mail? Like, that's where it all began in the 60s and 70s. Business felt that this was their way. It wasn't a digital sales job. It was an actually handwritten notice. And at that point, there was different and subsidized rates for different businesses. Second rates for newspapers, second-class rates for newspapers and magazines to encourage them to send their products through the mail. And then the big change. Payment went through the mail for checks and credit card checks. Like, that was the only way that people were being paid back in those days. And the one thing I've added here, that anybody ever seen The Miracle of 34th Street, the movie? Anybody? Go back and see it sometimes, because one of the classic scenes in there has got people sorting mail. And you just don't see a film image of that in many places. I don't know why I included it there, but that's there. And now we're going to do a walk to the main plant. By the way, the main plant for the postal workers was where Scotiabank Arena is now. They tore down that post office to build that arena. So we're going to walk, we're going to go across Front Street and then down Bay Street. And again, there's still a few vestiges of it in the hallway there, and I'll continue my conversation with you down there. And I'll turn this on.
Okay, we can go, folks. Just want to make sure everybody can get across. Okay, we can go, folks. Just want to make sure everybody can get across.
Have you ever seen a male have leather jackets? You see a leather jacket with wheel too?
Office have these old, I think the term is bas relief, and it was supposed to be images of communication. Some of them are pretty racist. You just go around, and there's not many of them left, but you should see them. They're all the way down to the lakeshore. There's ones with dog sleds, there's ones with a seaplane, but this is from the old post office. And you can see this one here. You see, at least it's a communication theme. I'd give them that, right? Like, so he's calling out to someone from afar. You go around the corner and there's people beating on a drum to contact people. And then further down, there's the dog sled. You don't know if they're carrying mail, but I remember coming down here as a kid and going down, and I wanted to make sure they weren't, because what happens in our city is it's all gone, right? In no order. And nobody does kind of art like this anymore. It's a beautiful, outside of the racist content, don't get me wrong when I say it this way, but the art it's quite a classic work of art. So we're going to go inside here, that gate over there, and now okay, can you see up at the top there? Toronto Postal Delivery. This is all that's left. This was incredible. 60% of the mail in Canada came through here. 60%. And at one point, oh God, I hope I put my notes somewhere. It was like 9 million pieces a day, and they came through here. And there's a photo of the old place on the right there that's hard to tell, but there's a little bit. So this, in 1938, this was commissioned to be built. In 1940s, this was used as World War II warehousing. World War II, there was a lot of other activities going on, and because it was a federal government building, they used it for a lot of supplies, munitions, whatever. And then it opened as a postal terminal in 1946. And then the mail operations ran here from 46 to 88. And then they all moved. These two brothers work at one of these centers, but the big change for a lot of us in Toronto was when South Central opened. You guys ever been on Eastern Avenue, east of Leslie? That's where that first plant was opened. And then there's one in Mississauga. That's at Dixon Road in Eglinton, and they were the first two. And then every other main center in Canada had one. The operations of mail ended here in the 80s. And then anybody here ever go to Maple Leaf Gardens? It closed in the 1980s, and then the Maple Leaf Gardens, it closed in 1999, and at that point this was called the Air Canada Centre before Scotiabank took it over, and it opened in 1999. So this was the location, and this was called Terminal A, I think, because it was, it was also part, by the way, which is, for some of you who may not remember those days, but Toronto and Montreal were still competing with their kind of sense of centrality, and Montreal was declining with deindustrialization, and Toronto was growing. And so more mail came through here than went through Montreal. So the end of World War II, now this is the big shift, was the sorting power of the power of the sorters. It was unbelievable back then, because it was all their visual. They had to know every street in the section that they were responsible for. So that and it was cursory. How many people, there was lots of young people can't read cursing and writing anymore, right? But then again, it would come in, they would have to get, it's Lisker Street, it goes over here, right?
This is before postal codes?
Correct, thank you. This is before postal codes, which then was the sorting machines.
Oh.
No, it's very important. So they had the power. And it was interesting that a lot of them were World War II vets, as were the supervisors. And the supervisors initially were in the Union too, until in '65, no more, get out. Because again, they scabbed during that '65 strike, the supervisors. So anyways, but there also was this kind of loyalty, because they'd been through World War II together. And so the sorters not only had the power of controlling production, but they also had a loyalty to the supervisors based on a common experience in World War II, which was a horrendous experience. They saw people die, they saw homes destroyed, and so they came back, and again, the sorters just wanted to keep the mail going. That was their deal. They would come to work in suits and little ties. Like, that's the way the culture was. But then everything shifted around '64. Canada Post, with the increase in mail, decided to bring in more and more part-timers to break the back of the sorters' power. And again, they also too, it was interesting. I'm a municipal worker. I've always known that there's these tiers in terms of wages. You think that anybody who works for a city is compared to a police officer or a firefighter? No, we're third after them, right? And so at one point, though, postal sorters made the same wages as police officers and firefighters. But in the 60s, that changed. And so the sorters finally decided that maybe we must do something about this. Now, the other thing you need to know in labor law, it depends on where you're working. So the federal government, Canadian Post was a federal operation. They could make legislation that didn't allow you to join a union, didn't allow you to go on strike. They could just do what they wanted to. So in 65, postal workers had enough, and they went out on an illegal walkout from coast to coast. And even the Canadian Labour Congress didn't support them initially. It took 12 days of the strike before the Canadian Labour Congress came on side. So they're also, and we were just talking about this with my steelworker sister over here, that unions don't necessarily always support each other. Sometimes you need to learn this, and it's tough sometimes, because we're always bred to think of solidarity, but it doesn't always happen. So anyways, they're out, and what they gained in that strike, they got a 12% wage increase. They got legislation, because this is the other thing that postal workers did. Every other employee that worked for the federal government was granted the right to join a union and granted the right to go on strike if they chose to. So when the postal workers oftentimes, which people don't realize, when they gain things for themselves, they gained it for a whole other slew of people. And they should always be thanked for that. The leaders that came out of the Canadian Postal Employees Association didn't support the strike, and in the first convention after the strike, they were thrown out of the union, and CUPW then formed. And by the way, I don't think I'm going to ask you to walk there, but do people know where the King Eddie Hotel is? You ever been there for tea?
No.
You should go there for tea sometime. I have an aunt that was her deal, right? You get strawberries and all that. She just loved it to pieces, and that would be a nice thing to do on a Sunday afternoon. Anyway, sorry to go on, but that's the King Eddie Association for me. It's on King Street, and it is east of Yonge Street. But I just felt that might be too far a walk, because then we'd have to go up and across. But that's where the CUPW was formed in 1965 after that strike. Now, what I know, because I'm a municipal worker, we could be denied a unionization if a city councillor would put in a veto vote against us. And the only way we could get unionization in the 60s is we had to have certification strikes. So we had to go out on strike for the employer to agree to have a union. And that's what the postal workers literally did. They went on a certification strike in 65 because it was illegal. And so then they got unionized, and I know this well. For CUPW history, there was 12 different custodial staff north of Sudbury that went on strike in 66, and that changed the laws for us. Because all the Sudbury steelworkers supported them, and finally we got it. Now, this is the big change at that point. Business began to do the bulk mailings, the billings. Because that changed, like I said earlier. Prior to this, it was cards and individual letters. But then all of a sudden, you were getting bulk mailing coming in. Then and the volume of mail doubled in very short order. The business mail was 85%, and there were 20 million pieces a day. And the post office at that point tried that guaranteed next day delivery. I don't know if people remember that. That was a big deal at the time. Now the 70s though, because again, the term that some of us use for the amount of strikes that CUPW had and that kind of tension is we used to just call it simply rock and roll. Because the post office went out on strike 65, then 70, then 74, then 76, then 78. So it was part of their negative image in the press. But I just want to remind you, this was the 70s. Some of us were in the streets opposing the war in Vietnam. There were other unions that were rock and rolling too. The auto workers, steel workers. So there was the client. In 1976, over 1 million workers went to Ottawa on one-day strike to protest what was going on. So I'm just trying to, it wasn't just the postal workers that all of a sudden off their own to take all these things on. It was the climate of the time. I'm lucky, I mean, people used to look at me when they were in the 90s and say, I'm lucky, I wish I grew up in those days, but yes and no. You know what it is. You love when you were born, you love your family, and some days it's a positive experience, and there's other things that come with it as well. So in 76, there was rotating, oh no, sorry, I jumped too quick. So the real change though, and this is what my friend Ponche identified, with the beginning of the code, was automation. That's what these two brothers knew. So the sorters had the power. They would just look at a piece of mail and they knew where it needed to go. There was no code on that. They just knew every street in the city, every street in the region. But then they decided that automation was the way to go, and they spent billions of dollars creating these plans. By the way, I had a fight with a union brother recently who gave a negative comment about postal workers. Who do you think is going to have to face AI big time going forward? It's going to be the postal workers. And they have stood against tech change and supported their members getting their rights at work. And again, you know, I will be with you guys in the end of May when you guys may have to go out again. So just so you know, and you guys have made a difference around fighting for tech change for other people. The other thing that the postal workers tried, which we could never do, but they did rotating strikes. That was the way of sharing the pain and doing the pain a little less for Canadians. But 78 was the bitter strike, and it changed relations forever. Because the federal government tried to narrow them in, and they had to put them through conciliation, and 16 months of negotiations for that agreement, and it still didn't come up with a settlement that the postal workers were comfortable with. So they finally went out on strike. And what happened instantly is the federal government, the Liberals and the Tories, worked together to pass back to work legislation. The RCMP raided CUPW offices and arrested the entire executive. I don't know if people remember the leader, the great leader for some of us, Jean-Claude Perrault. He was put in jail. Like, this was a different time. And the CLC did not, again, the Canadian Labour Congress did not support them, though others of us did. And finally the members went back to work, but a bitter, and I know this, I was part of a 50-day strike, City of Toronto, and members, it's not easy going on strike. Even if you get some money for being out, you lose money, you lose pension, you lose, you know, and your life is not about going on strike, it's going to work and standing up for your family, right? So again, the 78 strike left a lot of bitterness, because they went through these strikes about making sure that the part-timers were, to get them the same pay rates and benefits as the full-timers. And again, the other thing that often is forgotten, and you guys know this, truck drivers. They became postal workers. Do I put it in later? I mean, you may not know. Do you know do everybody remember what the October crisis was about? With the FLQ in Quebec? One of the demands of the FLQ at that point, there was a private trucking company that delivered mail in Quebec, the La Palme drivers. And Canada Post decided to bring trucking in to be run by Canada Post and fired all those workers. They were union too. So the CUPW workers in Montreal went out on a walkout to support the drivers, La Palme drivers. And believe it or not, which the FLQ, I mean, we'll have a long conversation some other time about sovereignty in Quebec, but it was one of the only union fights that they actually talked about, and it was about the La Palme drivers. So it was a direct connection to the postal workers at the time. But my point was, there's drivers, there's clerks, later they got a lot of IT workers, they had security. So it's not just the letter carriers and the sorters. CUPW recognizes and represents a lot of different workers, and those strikes were also about in trying to improve the benefits and the wages of all. They were always that way. By the way, what some of us never forget, because again, no disrespect to some unions, but some union staff and presidents make a hell of a lot of money more than their members, right? There's a gap like this. I had that big fight in my union all the time, just to try to keep my president, to keep her wages at the same rate as one of our workers. And I'm lucky. We had planners in our bargaining unit, and planners made a good buck back then. So I could always argue to her, well, you can get the rate as a planner then. But other unions, it's like double or triple. And postal workers, to their credit, have always kept their staff and their officials right at the same levels of their members. They also were famous, by the way, at their conventions, and to me, I don't want this one, that if a member wanted to say something, they would not end the convention. So sometimes they would go on till 5 in the morning because somebody would have some issue they wanted to bring up. So again, they were famous for that kind of stuff too. It's ultra democracy. And I don't know about you, but I like my sleep too. Anyway, so we're going to try to go across this thing. I'm hoping we can go up. Otherwise, we have to cross the street and climb the stairs. So now we're going to talk about today, meaning 1981, the strike for maternity leave. It was a 42-day strike. That's not a small length of time. And first national union to win maternity leave for its members. And again, what they said at the time was, women should not have to pay a penalty because they bear children and face a substantial loss in pay due to their pregnancy. That was the reality before that strike. And so again, there's a collective amnesia out there about those conditions. I mean, I still know, even with parental leave and maternity leave, all sorts of women that have to go back to work instantly because either they're pressured by their employer or whatever. But again, so just so we acknowledge that, and I'm somebody, it comes from another perspective. Maternity leave out of EI, like, what kind of country are we? You go to Sweden or any part of Europe, it's a separate entitlement. It's not an unemployment and benefit. It's because you're one of the citizens that's having a kid. So again, I find our country is so backward, but let me just give you these other parts. So the other thing about that strike, which is very important to remember, the women's movement came out in droves to support, and their allies to support CUPW during that time. There was at that point the National Action Committee for the Status of Women, NAC as it was known. They were going on picket lines with CUPW every day. They knew what the difference in this strike would mean. Other unions quickly, so once they finally won this, other unions followed suit, and the federal government had to then, and by the way, it was Justin's father, Justin Sinclair, I call him, and Pierre Trudeau, who actually then understood that if these guys are going to win it, we better give it to everybody else, and so they gave it out. And so the efforts of the CUPW members during the strike to illuminate the basic reality that progress does not happen without struggle and courage. Maternity leave was demonized by the media at the time. Maternity leave was deemed unnecessary and even a greedy request by women to be granted. And today isn't accepted as a fundamental right and actually a Canadian value. Because don't forget, south of us, they still don't have it as a full benefit to all Americans. Something that it's good to be reminded of with the current president down there. Now, how many people now enjoy maternity leave without knowing its history? I'd suggest very few. That's why I asked when you were born, right? Like, because again, and I understand this, it's not like somebody in public school told you our history of how we get entitlements, right? We kind of talked about whatever. What else was the common history we ever heard was trapping or something, right? And how about the weekend of the 8-hour day, pensions, minimum wage? Things that we now see as normal were often gained only after workers took the courageous step to go on strike. Now, didn't bring you juice, didn't bring you pop or anything, but I do think that we should raise our hands in salute to CUPW today on Mother's Day for maternity leave. And thank you, postal workers, wherever you guys are today. I really appreciate that. You guys did it for us all. Now, the other thing that happened back, so that in 1981, because CUPW it was always, like, as a public sector worker, they were always thinking politically. So they were always pushing the federal government to provide postal services to all. And at that point, there was legislation that passed that every Canadian is going to get postal service no matter where they live. And this was the time of the rural carriers. And then CUPW organized them, because initially the federal government didn't want to recognize rural carriers. So again, they're now members part of the union. And again, I don't know if people know about the fight around the postal boxes. Anybody get their mail from a postal box?
Yeah.
Okay, not to worry. I mean, we're lucky in the big city. My wife comes from Glengarry County, which is east of Cornwall. We get our mail through one of those boxes. But one of CUPW's fights was to stop postal boxes, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the year, but it was in the last, the Liberal time, where they stopped forcing new developments to put up the postal boxes. And again, there's a new campaign afoot. How many of you know isolated adults living by themselves in a home? And again, we're not even talking just seniors, but it could be anybody. And so some of us, I'm involved in another seniors organization, we support CUPW's plan to continue home delivery, so that, and part of the delivery is checking in on the person who's there, so that somebody will know how they're actually doing. And we're going to need that, aren't we? Because again, you can't always, families are tied up. They have to do all sorts of other things. They can't always get around. But that's what some of us are supporting right now. So the other thing that's kind of I, by the way, was a Christmas help worker. I loved that job. I would go around with a carrier and deliver it, because there were always special parcels during Christmas. And I was lucky. I lived in Chinatown at the time, the second Chinatown, off Spadina. And there was the office there at Spadina and Queen. And we'd go around to all those communities and deliver it. But in 1986, Canada Post announced this decision to close post offices. Toronto had 80 of them by 1920. And then they were down to 30 by the 60s. And I still remember the last two that were worked by CUPW members. There's that retail split, retail zone by the East plant, right on Eastern Avenue by Leslie. That was one of the last CUPW, yes, but CUPW had an outlet in there. And then the other one was on King Street, just east of Spadina. But we all know where they are now, Shoppers, right? And the other thing with Shoppers, they're non-union. So we all use them. And again, I'm not saying that, they do their job. They're good people, but it is part of Canada Post's strategy to move them into non-union locations and to do a public privatization. We're almost done, and then you won't be so bored. No, it's okay. I know what it's like. The other thing that CUPW did in '91, which was unique, is they signed solidarity pacts. Because at that point, you deliver the checks for some people. I don't know about retiring checks anymore, but back then it was social assistance checks. And again, the solidarity pact was, even if they would go out on strike, they were still going to deliver the checks. And that's quite a concession to give, because it actually shows this is what we need to do, right? So of course, there's two famous things, right? So Canada Post claimed that the picket lines were disrupting the check distribution, and suggested that there were these vans coming through that were, they were being blocked by picketers. So CUPW and went to the media and said, well, maybe you should stop those vans and see who's inside. You know who was inside? No checks, no mails. It was only scabs going in to help deliver the mail. And so Canada Post was lying at the time. The other one that's very interesting is the media made a big deal of interviewing with a woman that crossed the line to work who was a black single mother. And she made the point all over the media that the union was keeping her out of a job. The president of the union just said to his members, she said she could not afford to turn down the job she was offered. Don't be angry with her, because she's right. Don't forget, what the employer did a lot of times was they forced her to take the job, or they would deny her unemployment insurance or their social assistance rights. So if she turned down this opportunity to work, she might have been forced out of unemployment insurance or assistance. So Perot said, but do get angry at Canada Post. For when the strike is settled, Canada Post will throw her again on the unemployment line, and by then Canada Post and the media will have forgotten all about her. And his prediction came true. So that again was one of these cause celebs that happens. Now the present day, anybody know who Jan Simpson is? She's CUPW president, proud of. Her family came from the Barbados when she was 3, and she worked for Canada Post for 30 years before becoming a CUPW national rep in 2011. She's constantly raised concerns about the safety of Amazon workers. You know what Amazon did in Quebec? So they organized one of the Amazon plants, and what Amazon did was they moved all of their plant out of Quebec. It's the same thing that Walmart did in Quebec too. Like, this is corporate power. By the way, I'm going to make one positive comment about one corporate citizen, because I just discovered this the other day. I'm not a Costco fan, but my family loves it. But they maintained, remember Trump cut out the, what's it called? Thank you. Costco maintained it. So they still hire people based on all those different equity thresholds. And I think that's fantastic. Whereas Walmart canceled it, a number of the other big US corporations went along with Trump and killed that stuff. Equity hiring makes a difference. That's what changes our world. So I give a credit where credit is due. My family will be happy to see. Now the last piece today, because CUPW has also done this amazing demand for postal-backed banking. Again, they've tried to keep up with the times, trying to keep up with other options, and trying to look for different work for their members. Because of course, rural communities, how many banks I know banks that closed down in the city of Toronto and moved up, right? A lot of Indigenous communities don't have bank branches. So now Canada Post recently launched, it's called My Money Account. It's a new spending and savings account. And it gives Canadians a fresh approach to personal finance, cashback, interest earning potential, and credit banking opportunity. And even Canada Post admitted in a press release that this is a testament and a vision and dedication of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers for their foresight in dreaming up and supporting this initiative. So again, kudos for CUPW for starting that, because a lot of Canadians are going to benefit from that. So I don't know, yes? Yeah, but this is the name of it. I think you go through this outfit. So it's not My Money Account, and there's a company that's involved with it. So you can put your money through that. I'm sorry, so just look up My Money, which is all one word. So it's MY Money, all one word, account. And I think it should come up on a search engine. It's everywhere. Yeah. And they just announced this in the last 2 months, actually.
You can just go to a retail post office.
Yeah, go to a retail post office.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. See? That's who to ask. I'm afraid I'm still catching up. So I really hope you enjoyed this today. I know it wasn't the outside of the sun walk that maybe some of you were looking for, but I just wanted you to see the locations where postal workers worked for years, how much they changed our lives. They made a difference. Oh, God, I skipped one part where the cleaners at South Central, they were non-union, and they had to go out strike for 5 weeks to get unionized. Another group that had to go out to get and I know this well, because the City of Toronto, we had to fight to keep our cleaners in-house. Because I don't know what it is with public employees. They figure we might as well get rid of these workers to save money. And the only time that I would always comment on people, everybody remember SARS?
Yeah.
The one thing about SARS that I'll never forget and remind people all the time, cleaners were identified as part of the health system. Because again, you can't keep somebody healthy unless they have good cleaning going on in the facilities they're in. So anyways, I've been a long advocate for cleaners, and again, I'm proud of CUPW for standing up for the cleaners in your midst as well. So listen, thank you CUPW, and thank you all for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.